events move so rapidly that it is exceedingly difficult to state with technical accuracy the actual state of affairs, but it is clear that the peace of Europe cannot be preserved. We shall be supported throughout not only by the House of Commons, but by the determination, the resolution, the courage, and the endurance of the whole country.
A disastrous war may be averted. But should the worst happen after everything has been done that honour will permit, Australians will stand behind our own to help and defend her to the last man and the horse.
When the Australian divisions arrived in France in 1916, the war on the Western Front had long been in a hostile stalemate, which continued well into 1917. Losses on the Western Front were heavy, while gains were small. The light horse regiments that had remained in the Middle East in 1916 had been used in the defence of the Suez Canal, along with Allied action, to take back the Sinai Desert. In 1917, these forces pushed towards Palestine. On January 9, 1917, the use of unrestricted submarine warfare under the U-boat campaign was initiated by Germany in an act of desperation.
The Germans came in and sank both merchant ships and warships. Whatever they could, they sank. And their goal was to eliminate any trade into Britain or any supplies going into Britain. So basically trying to starve Britain out of the war.
The Germans believed that an attack of such ferocity could keep the United States out of the war.
The United States declared war on April the 6th, 1917. So they actually entered the war.
Meanwhile, on the Western Front, the German army had begun a tactical withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line, a chain of supposedly impregnable defences which they had been preparing for many months. Counterattacks by the Australian Light Horse in the Middle East helped to deplete Turkish forces. In late 1916, the Australian Light Horse took part in major operations at El Arish, Magdaba and Rafah, forcing a Turkish collapse. On March 26, 1917, the Anzac Mounted Division attacked Gaza. Although the Turkish position became perilous, the attack was called off when the need for water became critical. After a failed second attempt to take Gaza on April 19th, Allied commanders decided to outflank Gaza by turning towards the Turkish line at the town of Beersheba. This is where the Australian Light Horse would later write their name into history. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, the Australian 4th Division mounted a futile attack on the Hindenburg Line. Tanks were a new weapon in the modern war, and British General Sir Hubert Gough decided to employ 12 of these mechanical monsters to advance ahead of infantry at Bullecourt.
They were waiting and waiting, and the tanks just didn't turn up. And that then signalled to the Germans that we were there. So we fought ferociously and had heavy casualties with no protection, with no fire forward, which was the whole plan, using the tanks.
Incredibly, the Australians still managed to gain partial possession of the Hindenburg Line. The infantry deployed flares, requesting artillery support, but their pleas went unanswered.
So basically we were left extremely exposed.
The Australian infantry soon depleted their ammunition and were forced to retreat. The Australians had made no ground and suffered more than 3,000 casualties, with over 1,000 men taken prisoner. The Hindenburg Line was attacked for a second time at Bullecourt on the 3rd of May 1917. After 24 hours of conflict, only the Canadians at Fresnoy and the Australian 6th Brigade held any ground.
When you are losing people and there is such tragedy and it's just not working, time to pull back. But General Gough didn't want that to happen. He wanted to expand that area and expand that line.
A climax was reached in a final but furious encounter with the Germans on the 15th of May. The counterattack was repelled and the Germans withdrew. Although the Australians had successfully captured the area, the battle had cost the AIF almost 7,500 casualties. Modern warfare was a place of brutal realities, with weaponry designed to maim, gas meant to choke, and vehicles intended to inflict maximum damage.
The gas was very intense, chlorine gas, so there was a lot of major burns, mainly in the eyes, in the face, breathing, from these gases that were introduced also in the Western Front of World War I.
On the 4th of May 1917, in the North Sea, the Royal Australian Navy vessel Sydney was undertaking a sweep of channels southeast of Rosyth, Scotland, accompanied by a British warship, Dublin, and 4 destroyers. At 10:30 a.m, a 5-engined airship, a Zeppelin, was spotted to the east.
The Zeppelin, which is a huge inflatable aircraft, I suppose you'd call it, a bit like a hot air balloon. It was well armed.
The HMAS Sydney fired with anti-aircraft guns,
but they were pretty swift. Even though they weren't as nimble and as quick, it was interesting the manoeuvrable capability of those things.
The Zeppelin quickly returned and landed 3 bombs within 10 metres of one of the destroyers. The battle drew to an inconclusive end after the Zeppelin ran out of bombs and the Sydney ran out of ammunition at 2:30 p.m.
It was the first time that an Australian warship came under full air attack from the enemy.
An area known as Hill 60 was an objective for both armies on the Western Front. An ambitious plan was developed that, if successful, could have a lasting impact on the outcome of the war. In early 1915, British miners began tunnelling into Hill 60 towards German lines. And in November 1916, the first Australian tunnelling company joined the effort. When tunnelling was completed, the mines had been packed with 460 tonnes of explosives. An attack, codenamed Magnum Opus, was arranged for June 7, 1917, with the 0 hour at 3:10 a.m. A 7-day preliminary bombardment was conducted to put pressure on the enemy, and at 3:10 a.m. on the 7th of June 1917, the greatest explosion then known to humankind was set off, as the massive explosives secreted inside Hill 60 were detonated directly under the German lines.
And the explosion was so loud that the Prime Minister of London could hear it from his office.
It demolished a large part of the hill and obliterated 10,000 German soldiers. The explosion signalled the start of an attack designed to capture the strategically important high ground. By the evening of the 7th of June, the attack to take the ridge line was a tactical and strategic success. But success came at a price, and casualties within the 2nd Division numbered almost 14,000 men. After mid-1917, and after a series of mutinies in the overstretched French army,
actually all the countries there was a percentage of soldiers that just bailed. I mean, really, when you think of the whole, not just the physical aspect, but the whole mental aspect of the war, that a lot of them were going crazy.
The British forces had to assume an even greater role in the war. Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, the British Commander-in-Chief, launched an offensive at Ypres in Belgium. Haig unleashed his great attack on the 31st of July 1917 in a shattered, desolate landscape of mud.
The landscape was nothing. It was black, flat, mud, quicksand, and extremely dangerous.
As part of the attack at Ypres, the 4th and 5th Australian Divisions attacked the German stronghold of Polygon Wood. The last Australian attack, during the Third Battle of Ypres, attempted to capture the village of Passchendaele. The Australian 3rd Division and a New Zealand division advanced alongside 5 British divisions, but were bogged down in the valley well short of their objective. The weather made further attacks difficult because guns and ammunition supplies became stuck in the spongy ground.
There were thousands and thousands of troops that actually drowned. They drowned in the swamps.
As attacking efforts struggled, Allied spirits fell, while those of the German defenders rose.
We were really in a bad position.
Despite these dreadful conditions and the grievous losses, the British Army and its Commonwealth troops did succeed in capturing Passchendaele and part of the final ridge. It was the Canadian Corps that finally achieved this goal on the 6th of November. By November 1917, the last Australian division had been withdrawn from Ypres. The 5 Australian infantry divisions had fought in the line for 8 weeks and suffered more than 38,000 casualties. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the failed attacks at Gaza had forced the Allied commanders to decide to outflank Gaza and attack at Beersheba. On the 31st of October, Allied troops launched their great assault at dawn, but by late afternoon had made little ground. The capture of Beersheba became critical because of the need to obtain water from the town's wells.
Water was getting very, very desperate at that point of time, and it's a life or death when you're talking about desert campaigns in this situation. So realistically, if we hadn't have taken Beersheba, there would have been mass deaths from exhaustion and no water.
In a daring and heroic cavalry charge, the 4th and 12th Australian Light Horse Regiments made quick progress into the town.
We rode in on Beersheba, and it was the biggest military cavalry ride ever.
And at full gallop, they bore down on the Beersheba defences.
It was the only time that the light horse stayed on the horse through the entire battle, and they fought with the bayonets and a couple of handguns.
Upon reaching the trenches, many horses were brought down. The greater number of horsemen who successfully cleared the trenches or avoided them by veering to the left or right galloped straight for the enemy guns, capturing them before continuing on to Beersheba. From the time the regiments received orders to saddle up to their entry into Beersheba, less than 1 hour had passed. It had been a glorious hour, filled not only with military achievement of a rare kind, but with many memorable deeds by individual soldiers.
Really saving the entire campaign in that region.
The fall of Beersheba opened the Turkish defensive line. Gaza fell a week later, and on December the 9th, 1917, the city of Jerusalem was captured.
A lot of that's accredited to, and there's many books out there now about the Australian light horse and the light horsemen that actually did the blitz in those campaigns.
The battles and losses in 1917 had once again put an immense strain on Australia's voluntary recruitment system.
The voluntary recruitment levels just were not coming anywhere near the need of the war effort.
During the war, the range of men eligible to volunteer had already been expanded. Instead of seeking men between the ages of 19 to 38, the military called for volunteers from 18 to 45. However, there were many boys much younger than this who found their way onto the battlefield. On the 20th of December, the Prime Minister, Billy Hughes, put a second referendum to the Australian people asking, "Are you in favour of the proposal of the Commonwealth Government for reinforcing the Commonwealth forces overseas?" The proposal was that voluntary enlistment should continue, but that any shortfall would be met through compulsory conscription by ballot of single men, widowers and divorcees without dependents between 20 and 44 years of age. These men would be forced to go to war, to become compulsory heroes. The second referendum campaign was just as volatile as the first, divisive politically, socially, and within religious circles.
It became quite a horrible situation, and feel and morale was quite low in Australia.
The referendum was defeated, and this closed the issue of conscription for the remainder of the war. "1917 was a year where Australia experienced a bitter and gruelling general strike, street demonstrations about the war, along with food restrictions and a rising cost of living. The lists of the dead and wounded mounted. Families across the nation bore the weight of terrible grief and loss, while men overseas battled in atrocious conditions, led by often incompetent leaders into battles that would see men killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. Victories there were, but more evident was the human cost of war.